I asked my boyfriend's girl best friend to plan our engagement party. Everyone said I was insane. When my boyfriend Pedro proposed, I saw an opportunity. You see, his girl best friend Fiona had been a pain in the neck the entire relationship. She had spread awful lies about me at the start, ruined a couple of dates by showing up uninvited, and even tried to accidentally kiss Pedro using some TikTok trend. But I'd dealt with mean girls before. And high school taught me that sometimes the best way to expose someone is to give them exactly what they want and let them destroy themselves. So that's exactly what I did when I told Pedro. I'd really love it if Fiona planned our engagement party. My mom actually begged me not to do it. My best friend said I was setting myself up for disaster, but I just smiled and said Pedro believes in her, and I believe in Pedro. Maybe we'd all been misunderstanding her intentions. She deserves a chance to prove herself, I told them gently. And when we told Fiona, she was thrilled, of course, not knowing I was the one hanging the poisoned apple by a thread. The planning phase started pretty typically for Fiona. She showed up to our first meeting with invitation samples for the party, but they were drawn with crayon, clearly created to be ugly and unprofessional. My friends exchanged horrified looks, but I just smiled and started adding ribbons and pressed flowers and old baby photos of Pedro and me onto the invites. Suddenly, they looked adorable and unique. Fiona's face fell when everyone complimented them. Then came the venue booking. She'd somehow reserved the wrong date and ordered bland decorations, all problems I quickly fixed too. And soon, people were starting to see the pattern. The engagement party itself was where things really escalated. Fiona had been in charge of the seating chart and strategically positioned herself between me and Pedro at the head table. I watched as people whispered and stared at her with confused expressions. Even Pedro's mom mentioned out loud that it was odd. I let the awkward tension stretch until it was absolutely painful. Then I finally spoke up with a bright smile and said, "Fiona, you're so funny. You've switched our seats by accident, right?" Fiona's face paled, suddenly being put on the spot. She quietly agreed and switched spots, but she still hadn't learned her lesson. An hour in, Fiona got up to play the slideshow she had prepared. It was supposed to be about our relationship, but maybe 80% of it was just photos of her and Pedro growing up. I sat there with a pleasant expression the whole time. When it ended, I sat up clapping and said, "Wow, you know you guys have seriously been friends for a long time." Some people giggled, catching the sarcasm. Fiona looked hurt but couldn't say anything until it was speech time, where she emphasized that she and Pedro weren't just friends, they were best friends. She ended her speech saying, "I love you, Pedro," while making this intense eye contact that only made him want to crawl under the table and hide instead. Even his mom had her hand over her mouth. The rest of the guests sat stiff in their seats, having a hard time hiding how much they hated her. But Fiona misread their stares for admiration, and when she watched Pedro step away from me on the dance floor, she thought she had won him back. I watched her slip out to the hallway, hand on her phone looking absolutely giddy, clearly bragging to her friend about the successful day. She was far enough away that she probably thought no one could hear her. That's when I sent one of my little nieces to go over there and hand Fiona a microphone. The little girl was so sweet about it. She approached Fiona and lightly tugged on her dress. "Excuse me, miss," she said softly. Fiona didn't even look at her. She just rolled her eyes at the girl and said, "Don't you see I'm on the phone?" The little girl stood there a while longer, waiting for the call to end before tugging on Fiona's shirt again. This time, Fiona harshly snapped at the kid to go away. The thing was, the microphone had been live the entire time. The sound system had picked up everything, from cursing out an innocent kid to telling her friends that Pedro was always hers. I've broken up 3 of his relationships before. I can do it again. When Fiona walked back into the party, the entire room had gone silent. Everyone was staring at her with complete disgust. Pedro's mom was standing with her arms crossed. Pedro looked absolutely betrayed. "You should leave," Pedro's mom said, her voice practically trembling with anger. Other guests quickly piled on. "That's psychotic. Did you really just brag about ruining his relationships? This is why you'll always be just a friend." Fiona stood there with her mouth hanging open, trying to come up with an excuse. But it was too late. Pedro was done with her. "Delete my number. Lose my address. Don't ever show yourself in front of me ever again," he said, pointing to the door. Fiona begged and tried to blame me. She planned this. She set me up." I smiled. She was right, of course, but no one believed her. Not anymore. You set yourself up. She gave you a chance to be a decent person, to be happy for me, but you couldn't even manage that for one night. The venue's security escorted her out while she sobbed, but just as I thought I had gotten away, Pedro later pulled me close and whispered, "Did you plan that?" His breath felt warm against my ear, but his tone made my stomach drop like I'd swallowed ice. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out because the look on his face told me he already knew the truth. The victory I'd been riding for the past 20 minutes suddenly tasted bitter and wrong in my mouth. Around us, the remaining guests gathered their coats and purses while pretending they couldn't see us having this whispered conversation in the corner. Pedro's mom stood near the gift table with her arms crossed, watching us with this worried expression that made my chest feel tight. Across the room, my own mother shook her head slowly back and forth like she'd been expecting this exact moment all along. The venue staff moved between tables, collecting centerpieces and stacking chairs, their movements careful and quiet like they were trying to be invisible. I realized with this sick feeling that the party meant to celebrate our future had just become the night when everything got complicated in ways I hadn't planned for. Pedro stepped back from me and walked toward the exit without saying anything else. I followed him out to the parking lot where the spring air felt too cold against my flushed skin. My mom appeared beside my car before I could even get my keys out. Her face set in that disappointed expression I remembered from every time I'd gotten in trouble as a teenager. My best friend stood next to her with her arms crossed tight over her chest, not saying a single word, but somehow that silence felt louder than any lecture. I tried to explain that Fiona had been ruining our relationship for months, that she'd sabotaged Pedro's last 3 girlfriends, that someone needed to expose her before she destroyed us too. The words came out defensive and sharp, but even as I said them, they sounded hollow in my own ears. My mom cut me off mid-sentence and told me I'd gone way too far this time, that public humiliation wasn't the same as setting boundaries. I wanted to argue back, but my best friend's disappointed face made me close my mouth. They both got in their cars and left me standing alone in the parking lot with my phone starting to buzz in my purse. On the drive home, I pulled my phone out at a red light and saw 37 notifications lighting up the screen. Someone had posted a short video clip of the microphone incident, and it was already spreading across multiple platforms. I scrolled through the comments with one hand on the steering wheel and felt my stomach twist tighter with each new opinion. Half the people were calling me a genius for exposing Fiona so perfectly, saying she deserved everything she got for being such a terrible friend. The other half said I was toxic and manipulative, that engineering someone's public humiliation made me just as bad as her. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat, but could still feel it vibrating against the leather every few seconds with new comments and shares. When we got home, Pedro went straight to the bedroom and came back out carrying his pillow and the spare blanket from the closet. He asked if we could sleep in separate rooms tonight because he needed space to think about everything that happened. His voice sounded tired and sad in a way that made my throat feel tight. I ended up alone in our bedroom staring at the ceiling with the lamp still on, because closing my eyes just made me see his face over and over. That look of disappointment mixed with betrayal kept replaying in my head like a video stuck on loop. Every time I tried to tell myself I'd done the right thing, that Fiona had needed to be exposed, I saw Pedro's expression when he realized what I'd planned. The victory I'd wanted so badly didn't feel like winning anymore, just like I'd broken something important that I didn't know how to fix. I stayed awake until 3 in the morning thinking about all the mean girl tactics I'd learned in high school to take down people who crossed me. Back then, it felt like survival. Like the only way to protect myself in a world full of bullies was to strike first and strike harder than anyone expected. I remembered setting up Jessica Anderson by letting her think I was her friend, before exposing her lies to the whole cafeteria. I thought about how I'd destroyed Sarah Chen's reputation by carefully spreading just enough truth mixed with suggestions to ruin her social standing. Those victories had felt powerful at 16 when everything seemed like life or death. But lying here at 26 years old in the dark bedroom I shared with the man I wanted to marry, those same weapons suddenly felt wrong and childish. Maybe the tactics that helped me survive high school didn't belong in adult relationships where people were supposed to talk through problems instead of destroying each other. The next morning, Pedro and I sat at the Kit Smith table with 2 cups of coffee that neither of us actually drank. The steam rose up between us while we both stared at our phones or the table or anywhere except each other's faces. Finally, he set his mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the side and said the word I'd been avoiding since last night. He called what I did manipulation. Said I'd engineered a public humiliation instead of just talking to him about Fiona like an adult would have done. I wanted to argue, but instead heard myself listing all the boundary violations Fiona had committed over the past 2 years. My voice got defensive and sharp as I reminded him about the lies she spread when we first started dating, the dates she ruined by showing up uninvited, that weird TikTok kiss she tried to force on him. Pedro let me finish my whole list before responding in this quiet voice that somehow felt worse than yelling. He admitted that he'd let Fiona get away with too much for too long, because he didn't want to lose his oldest friend. He said he felt guilty for not protecting our relationship better, for making excuses every single time she crossed a line that should have been obvious. There was relief in hearing him finally acknowledge his part in everything, even though we were both sitting there feeling like we'd messed up in completely different ways. The honesty made the air between us feel less heavy, but also more fragile, like we were holding something breakable that could shatter if either of us moved wrong. Pedro reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb rubbing small circles on my palm, while he talked about how we needed to figure some things out before moving forward. We agreed to pause all the wedding planning for now, because we needed to work out if we were actually ready to get married, or if we were just rushing towards something to avoid dealing with our real problems. The words hung heavy in the air between us, and I felt scared for the first time that I might have broken something I couldn't fix, no matter how hard I tried. Pedro squeezed my hand once before pulling away and standing up to dump his untouched coffee down the sink. I spent that whole afternoon going through every social media app and silencing notifications one by one. The video clip had spread way further than I'd expected, jumping from friends to acquaintances to complete strangers who had opinions about people they'd never met. My phone buzzed every 30 seconds with new comments and shares and reactions until I wanted to throw it against the wall. Each alert felt like someone pointing at me and listing everything I'd done wrong. All my mistakes laid out for public judgment. When I finally got all the notifications turned off, the quiet that followed felt almost worse than the constant buzzing. Like the absence of noise just made more room for my own guilty thoughts to fill up the space. That evening, my phone buzzed with a new direct message notification, and I almost ignored it until I saw the name. Maddie Lindsay, one of the girls who was always hanging around Fiona at parties and events, had sent me a long paragraph. I opened it and started reading about how calculated and cruel I was, how I'd sabotaged someone who never stood a chance against my schemes. She asked how I slept at night knowing I humiliated someone in front of 100 people, and the words hit harder than I expected because she wasn't totally wrong. I started typing a response about all the things Fiona had done first, then deleted it and typed something about how Fiona exposed herself, then deleted that too. My third attempt was just defensive and mean, so I deleted it as well before closing the app and tossing my phone onto the couch cushion beside me. Sleep didn't come easy that night because Maddie's question kept playing in my head on repeat. The next morning, I woke up to an email notification from Tony Ogden, the venue coordinator who'd been so helpful during our planning process. The subject line said something about a formal complaint, and my stomach dropped before I even opened the full message. She explained that Fiona had filed an official complaint about the microphone incident, and the venue needed written statements from both me and Pedro about what happened. There was a whole section about their policy regarding audio equipment being used to cause distress to guests, with legal language that made everything feel suddenly very real and very serious. My hands started shaking while I held my phone, reading through the email twice to make sure I understood what was asked. This wasn't just drama anymore or people being mad at me online. This was becoming an actual documented thing with policies and procedures. I forwarded the email to Pedro without adding any message because I didn't know what to say, then sat there staring at my phone, feeling the weight of consequences settling onto my shoulders. Later that morning, I made myself do something I'd been avoiding since the party ended. Someone had posted the full audio recording online and it had been shared hundreds of times, but I'd only listened to little clips while celebrating my victory. Now I pulled up the full 3-minute recording and hit play, really listening this time instead of just enjoying Fiona getting caught. Her voice came through the speakers talking about how the party was going so well, how Pedro kept looking at her during the slideshow, how she could tell he was remembering their history together. Then came the part where my niece tried to hand her the microphone and Fiona snapped at her to go away, her voice sharp and mean in a way that made me cringe now. But the worst part was hearing the exact moment when her confession about breaking up Pedro's relationships got broadcast to the whole room, the sudden silence that followed, the gasps and angry voices rising up. I could identify the precise second where my plan crossed from exposing truth into something meaner, something that felt less like justice and more like revenge. The shame that flickered through me was new and uncomfortable, sitting heavy in my chest in a way I couldn't just push away or justify. That afternoon, I found my niece playing with dolls in my sister's backyard during a family visit. She was making up some elaborate story about princesses and dragons, her little voice doing different characters with complete commitment. I knelt down next to her on the grass and waited until she paused her game to look up at me with those big, trusting eyes. I apologized for putting her in the middle of adult drama, for asking her to deliver that microphone without explaining what would happen. She was only 7 years old and didn't understand any of the complicated relationship stuff, just that her aunt had asked her to do something and she wanted to help. I told her she didn't do anything wrong at all, that the grown-ups were the ones who messed up, not her. Then I took her to get ice cream at the shop down the street, letting her order whatever she wanted with extra toppings, trying to make up for using her innocence as part of my scheme. She seemed happy enough with the ice cream, but I still felt guilty watching her eat it, knowing I'd involved a kid in something that got so ugly so fast. 3 days after the party, Pedro's mom called and invited us to brunch at her favorite cafe to talk about next steps as a family. We met her there on Sunday morning, and she was kind but direct from the moment we sat down, not wasting time on small talk before diving into the real conversation. She said both Fiona and I had made mistakes in how we handled things, though she made it clear she was firmly on our side about Fiona needing to stay away from now on. We spent nearly 2 hours sitting in that booth talking through how to handle upcoming family events, whether Fiona's name should even come up in conversation anymore, what to tell relatives who asked questions. Pedro's mom had always liked Fiona because they'd known each other since Pedro was a kid, but she wasn't making excuses for the boundary violations anymore. She helped us figure out a plan for weddings and holidays and birthdays, all the gatherings where Fiona used to show up automatically because she was considered family. By the time we finished our coffee and paid the bill, I felt like we had a real strategy, instead of just reacting to whatever happened next. Pedro came home from work the following Tuesday looking completely exhausted, his shoulders slumped and his face tight with stress. He dropped his bag by the door and told me that his coworker had shown him the viral clip during lunch, asking if that was really his engagement party in the video everyone was sharing. The story was making rounds at his office with people he barely knew suddenly interested in his personal life, wanting details and gossip about our relationship drama. He was embarrassed about the whole thing becoming public entertainment, protective of both of us even though he was still processing his own hurt about how I'd handled everything. Some people at work thought the microphone thing was funny or justified, while others looked at him differently now, like our relationship was messy and dramatic. He hated that our private problems were being discussed in the break room and analyzed by strangers online who didn't know anything real about us. That evening, my best friend called and didn't let me off easy like some other people had been doing. She said I needed to own what I did with Pedro instead of just defending myself and listing all of Fiona's crimes like that made everything okay. She reminded me that being right about Fiona being toxic and manipulative didn't automatically make my method acceptable. That manipulation was still manipulation, even when it was aimed at someone who probably deserved consequences. I tried to argue that Fiona had it coming, that she'd been sabotaging Pedro's relationships for years, but my friend cut me off and said I was missing the point. The point was that I'd engineered a public humiliation using a 7-year-old kid as my messenger, and that wasn't who I wanted to be as a person. I hung up feeling defensive and called out in equal measure, wanting to be mad at her for not taking my side, but knowing deep down she was right about most of it. The next morning, I spent almost an hour drafting and redrafting a message to Fiona on my phone. I proposed that we both agree to stop talking about each other publicly, to just let the whole thing die down instead of making it worse. My finger hovered over the send button for 20 minutes because reaching out felt like admitting something, like acknowledging that maybe I'd gone too far even if she'd been awful first. But the alternative was letting this whole situation spiral further with lawyers and venue complaints and endless social media drama. I finally sent the message with my heart pounding in my chest, then immediately regretted it and wanted to unsend it but couldn't. I spent the next hour obsessively checking my phone to see if she'd read it, if she was typing a response, what she might say back. Fiona replied within an hour, and her message was full of anger and accusations that I had to read 3 times to fully process. She said she was consulting a lawyer about defamation and emotional distress, about what I'd done to her reputation and mental health. She called me a snake who'd planned her destruction from the very start, who'd never given her a real chance and just waited for the perfect moment to strike. She said Pedro would eventually see who I really am, that the truth always comes out about manipulative people. I felt my fear spike while reading her words, realizing this might actually turn into a legal situation instead of just drama. I closed the message and tried to breathe normally, reminding myself that she was probably just threatening and upset, but I couldn't shake the worry that she might actually follow through. That evening, Tony from the venue emailed again with a detailed outline of their audio equipment policy and liability guidelines. She suggested a mediated phone call to resolve the complaint, keeping everything professional, but I could read between the lines that they were taking this seriously. The email mentioned potential impacts to our deposit and future bookings if we couldn't reach a resolution, basically saying this could cost us money and cause real problems. I forwarded the email to Pedro without commentary, and we ended up staring at our phones in different rooms of the apartment, both processing what this meant. The fun celebration we'd planned had turned into complaints and policies and potential legal issues, everything getting more complicated and serious with each passing day. The next morning, I woke up to find Pedro already sitting at the Kit Smith table with 2 mugs of coffee, one placed across from him like an invitation to talk. I sat down slowly and wrapped my hands around the warm cup while he stared at his own drink for what felt like forever before finally speaking. He said we should try couples therapy before making any more wedding plans, that he wants to marry me, but we clearly have serious issues to work through first. His voice was steady, but I could see his jaw working like he was chewing on difficult words, and he talked about trust and how we handle conflict, and whether we're actually ready for marriage. I felt this weird mix of nervous and hopeful wash over me, because part of me was scared of what a therapist might uncover, all the ugly parts we've been avoiding, but another part felt relieved that he wasn't just giving up on us. I told him I thought therapy was a good idea, and watched his shoulders drop like he'd been holding his breath waiting for my answer. That afternoon, we sat side by side on the couch with my laptop balanced between us, searching for therapists who work with couples on boundary issues and premarital stuff. Pedro made a detailed list on his phone of questions to ask during consultations, things like their approach to conflict and how many sessions we'd need, and whether they'd seen situations like ours before. I pulled up review sites and scrolled through ratings while checking which therapists took our insurance, writing down names and phone numbers in a notebook. It felt good to work together on something helpful instead of just managing all the drama from the party, like we were finally doing something to fix things instead of just reacting to problems. We made calls to 3 different offices and scheduled consultation appointments, and by the time we finished, I felt more hopeful than I had in days. A week later, we walked into Eliza Napier's office for our first real session, and I was so nervous my hands were shaking. She was maybe 40 with kind eyes and a calm way of speaking that made the room feel safe, and she started by having us establish ground rules for honest talking. She asked us to commit to speaking our truth even when it's hard, to listen without planning our defense, to assume good intentions from each other. Then she looked directly at me and asked if I engineered the whole microphone situation at the engagement party. Just put it out there like it was a simple yes or no question. My face burned hot with shame, and and I felt Pedro shift beside me, and I admitted that yes, I planned it. I set the whole thing up to expose Fiona publicly. The words came out quiet and small, and saying it out loud to a stranger made it sound so much worse than it had in my head when I was planning everything. I tried to explain my reasoning, how Fiona had sabotaged the relationship for so long, and I wanted her to destroy herself. But the explanation felt hollow in that office with Eliza watching me carefully. Pedro sat there listening, and I couldn't read his face, couldn't tell if he was angry or disappointed or just processing. Then Eliza turned to him and asked about his friendship with Fiona, and I watched my fiancé take a deep breath before talking. He acknowledged his history of terrible boundaries with her, how he prioritized her feelings over mine for years without even realizing it. His voice got thick when he talked about the guilt he feels, about being confused and not knowing how to let go of a friendship that had become so unhealthy and toxic. He said he kept making excuses for her behavior because she'd been his friend since childhood, and he didn't want to believe she was actually trying to hurt his relationships. Eliza listened without any judgment on her face, just nodding and taking notes, and I saw Pedro more clearly in that moment than I had in months. I saw someone who was genuinely struggling with losing a friend, who felt guilty for enabling bad behavior, who wanted to do better but didn't know how. When the session was winding down, Eliza gave us homework to complete before next time. She said we needed to write a joint boundary statement about Fiona and commit to no contact going forward, that we had to be a united team instead of me scheming behind his back and him enabling her. She talked about how healthy relationships require direct communication, even when it's really uncomfortable, and that we both needed to practice being honest with each other instead of using our old patterns. We left the office holding hands, and I felt like maybe we could actually fix this mess, like there was hope for us if we kept doing the work. That evening, we sat on the couch with the laptop open between us and started drafting a short message to Fiona together. It took us almost an hour because we kept rewriting sentences, trying to be clear but not mean, firm but not cruel. The final version said we need space and won't be responding to any further contact from her, that we wish her well, but our friendship is over, and that's final. Pedro's hands were shaking when he moved the cursor over the send button, and I could see him hesitating, probably thinking about all their years of friendship and all the good memories mixed in with the bad. But then he clicked it, and the message disappeared into cyberspace, and I felt proud of him for finally choosing us clearly, and without reservation. Fiona responded within minutes like she'd been waiting by her phone, and the message asked to speak to Pedro alone just once to get closure. She said she deserved a chance to explain herself without me controlling what gets said, and I watched Pedro's face soften with that old loyalty he's always had for her. I felt panic rising in my chest because I could see him wavering, see that part of him that still cared about her feelings wanting to give her what she asked for. But we'd literally just talked about this in therapy an hour ago, about being a team and not letting her split us up, so I stayed quiet and waited. Pedro stared at his phone for a long time before typing back that we're handling things together now, that there won't be any private conversations or chances to change his mind. Then he blocked her number while I squeezed his hand hard, and I felt relief flood through me. Midweek, Pedro met his coworker Aurelia McLean for lunch to ask advice about handling all the gossip at his office. He came home that evening looking lighter than he had in days and told me what she said. Aurelia told him to issue one brief statement saying he considers the engagement party situation private and won't discuss it further, then refuse to engage no matter how much people push for details. She said feeding the rumor mill only makes it worse, and people will get bored and move on if he stops giving them material. Pedro seemed grateful for the practical guidance from someone outside our situation, someone who understood office politics and could give him a clear strategy. That same evening, my mom called with another lecture about how I handled everything, her voice tight with disapproval. She went on about manipulation and public humiliation, and how I should have just talked to Pedro like an adult, and I felt myself getting defensive before I remembered what Eliza said about boundaries. I interrupted her mid-sentence and told her I need her to stop managing this situation, that I'm an adult dealing with adult problems, and I need to figure it out with Pedro and our therapist. I said I love her, but I can't keep getting constant reminders of my mistakes from her, that it's not helping and it's just making me feel worse. She went quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd gone too far, but then she agreed to step back and let me handle it. I felt this weird mix of guilty for shutting her down and relieved to have one less person judging my choices. In our second therapy session the following week, Eliza had us explore the difference between survival tactics and partnership skills, and it was harder than I expected. I talked about learning to strike first in high school, because being open and trusting meant getting hurt by mean girls who saw kindness as weakness. I explained how I learned to read people and figure out their plans and beat them to the punch, how that felt like the only way to protect myself back then. Pedro discussed his pattern of avoiding conflict to keep everyone happy, how he learned that if he just stayed quiet and didn't rock the boat, then people wouldn't fight. Eliza pointed out that we're both using strategies that made sense when we were teenagers, but don't work in a healthy adult relationship. She said my striking first means I never give people a real chance to be decent, and Pedro's conflict avoidance means problems just grow bigger until they explode. We both sat there feeling called out, but also understanding something important about ourselves and each other. 3 days later, an email from Tony Ogden popped up in my inbox with the subject line, "Formal Incident Report, Statement Required." I opened it and found a PDF attachment that was 5 pages long with official letterhead and legal language about audio equipment misuse and guest complaints. The form asked for a detailed written account of the events leading up to the microphone incident, my role in planning it, and my understanding of how it affected other guests. I printed it out and sat at the Kit Smith table staring at the blank lines where I was supposed to write my statement. An hour passed while I just looked at the questions, my pen hovering over the paper without making contact. Every question felt like a trap designed to make me admit I was wrong, and my brain kept trying to find ways to word things that would make me sound less guilty. I started writing 3 different versions that made excuses or blamed Fiona's past behavior before I stopped myself and remembered what Eliza said about accountability. I forced myself to write the truth without any sarcasm or justification, just flat descriptions of what I planned and why I did it. The first sentence came out simple and damning. I asked my niece to bring Fiona a live microphone because I wanted everyone to hear what she was saying in the hallway. Each sentence after that felt like pulling teeth, because I had to describe my planning without defending it or explaining how Fiona deserved it. I wrote about choosing my niece specifically because she seemed innocent, about timing it so Fiona would be on the phone bragging, about knowing the sound system would broadcast everything to the party. Eliza's voice played in my head, reminding me that owning my choices meant not making excuses, so I kept my descriptions factual and clear. When I finished the first draft, I read it back and caught myself trying to sneak in phrases like, "after years of boundary violations," and "following multiple incidents of sabotage," that were technically true but felt like justifications. I deleted those parts and rewrote them to focus only on what I did, not what Fiona did first. The final version was 2 pages of plain facts about my manipulation that made me feel sick to read, but also strangely lighter, like I was finally being honest about something I'd been hiding from myself. I proofread it twice more to remove any remaining snark before scanning it and sending it back to Tony with shaking hands. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from friends asking if I'd seen Fiona's latest social media post. I opened the app and found a long caption on a photo of a sunset that didn't mention any names, but was clearly about me. She wrote about betrayal and public humiliation, about people who smile to your face while planning your destruction, about learning who your real friends are when someone orchestrates your worst moment for entertainment. The post had dozens of comments from people who didn't know the full story, offering sympathy and asking what happened. My anger rose fast and hot in my chest, because she was playing the victim after everything she'd done to sabotage Pedro's relationships for years. My thumbs moved to the comment section, ready to type out the truth about her confession on that microphone, about the 3 relationships she admitted to breaking up, about every boundary she'd crossed. I started typing a response that laid out her history of manipulation, but stopped when I remembered what Eliza said about not feeding into drama. The algorithm rewards conflict, and I'd be giving Fiona exactly what she wanted by engaging publicly. I deleted my half-written comment and closed the app without responding, then grabbed my shoes and went for a walk around the neighborhood. The whole walk, I kept thinking of perfect responses that would expose her lies, imagining the satisfaction of posting evidence and watching people turn against her. But I also knew that public performance wouldn't actually fix anything between me and Pedro, wouldn't help us build the trust we needed going forward. By the time I got home, my anger had cooled into something more like tired acceptance that some people would believe her version, and I couldn't control that. At our therapy check-in later that week, Eliza asked if we'd seen Fiona's social media activity and how we handled it. Pedro admitted he'd been tempted to comment, but decided against it, and I told her about my walk and choosing not to engage. She smiled and said she was proud of us for resisting the urge to defend ourselves publicly. "The algorithm rewards conflict," she explained while leaning forward in her chair. "Every comment, every response, every public back and forth just feeds the drama and keeps it alive longer. You need to invest your energy in private repair instead of public performance." Her words hit me hard because I'd spent so much of my life caring about how things looked to other people, about winning in ways everyone could see. The idea that staying quiet could be a choice instead of a loss felt new and uncomfortable. She explained that people who wanted to believe Fiona would believe her regardless of what we said, and people who knew us would trust us without needing a public statement. "You're not losing by staying silent," she said firmly. "You're choosing something healthier for your relationship and your own peace of mind." I left the session feeling less like I was being a coward by not fighting back, and more like I was actually being stronger by not letting Fiona pull me into her drama. That evening, Pedro got a message on social media from someone named Jessica Chen, asking if she could talk to him privately. He showed me the message, and I recognized the name as one of his ex-girlfriends from a few years back. She said she had something important to tell him about their breakup, and asked if they could have a quick call. Pedro looked nervous but curious, so I told him to call her while I was there, and he put it on speaker. Jessica's voice came through sounding apologetic and a little embarrassed. She said she'd seen the viral video from our engagement party and recognized Fiona's voice admitting she'd broken up Pedro's previous relationships. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "When we broke up, I believed things Fiona told me about you without questioning them. She said you'd been talking about other girls, that you weren't serious about our relationship, that you were just using me until someone better came along. Pedro's face went pale as she continued explaining how Fiona had poisoned their relationship with small comments and manufactured drama until Jessica didn't trust him anymore. Seeing that video made me realize I'd been manipulated, she said. I'm so sorry I didn't see it back then. I should have talked to you directly instead of believing her. Pedro thanked her for reaching out, and they talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. After the call ended, we both sat in heavy silence processing what we'd just heard. I felt sad for all the relationships Fiona had damaged, all the years of manipulation that had cost Pedro connections with people who actually cared about him. We stayed on the couch that evening talking through what we now understood about Fiona's pattern of interference. Pedro shared stories I'd never heard before about his relationship with a girl named Sarah in college, how Fiona had shown up at their dates and created awkward situations that made Sarah uncomfortable. He talked about another girlfriend who suddenly became distant after spending time with Fiona at a party, how she broke up with him a week later without giving a clear reason. I shared my own observations about the ways Fiona had tried to undermine our relationship from the start, the lies she spread and the boundaries she crossed that I'd documented in my head. We weren't talking about revenge anymore, just trying to understand the full picture of what had been happening for years while Pedro made excuses and I planned my schemes. I should have seen it sooner, Pedro said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. I kept telling myself she was just protective or jealous in a friend way, but she was actively sabotaging my relationships because she wanted me for herself. I squeezed his hand and told him we both made mistakes in how we handled things, that understanding the pattern now meant we could move forward with clarity about what healthy boundaries actually look like. Pedro called his mom midweek to talk about establishing a consistent family message about boundaries with Fiona. I could hear his mom's voice through the phone speaker as they discussed how to handle the situation going forward. She agreed that everyone in the family needed to support the no-contact decision, instead of trying to fix things or play mediator between them. I made excuses for her over the years, his mom admitted, her voice carrying guilt and determination. I've known her since she was a little girl, and I wanted to believe she was just going through a phase or struggling with growing up, but I can't ignore what she did anymore, and I can't put her feelings above your well-being. They talked through specific scenarios like what to do if Fiona showed up at family events or tried to contact relatives to get messages to Pedro. His mom suggested they tell extended family members that Fiona is no longer welcome and asking them to respect that boundary without needing all the details. Pedro's shoulders relaxed as they aligned on a plan, clearly relieved to have his mom fully supporting the decision instead of pushing him to forgive and forget. During that same call, his mom brought up the idea of officially disinviting Fiona from all future family events to make the boundary crystal clear. Your cousin's wedding is coming up in 6 months and your aunt's birthday party is next month, she said carefully. We need to let people know ahead of time that Fiona won't be attending so there's no confusion or awkward situations at the door. Pedro agreed, but I could hear the heaviness in his voice, the grief of officially ending a friendship that had shaped his whole life since childhood. They talked through the logistics of telling family members and how to handle questions about why Fiona was no longer were included. When he finally hung up, Pedro sat staring at his phone for a long moment before his eyes got watery. I moved closer and wrapped my arms around him while he processed losing someone who had been like family for over 20 years. He didn't cry exactly, but his breathing got uneven, and he held onto me tight like he needed the physical support to stay upright. It's the right thing to do, he said after a while, but it still hurts like hell. I just held him and didn't try to fix it or make it better, understanding that some losses need to be felt even when they're necessary. The mediated call with Tony and Fiona happened on a Tuesday morning, and we were both nervous wrecks beforehand. We sat at the Kit Smith table with Pedro's laptop between us, coffee cups forgotten and cold while we waited for the video call to start. Tony's face appeared first, professional and neutral, and she explained the ground rules for the conversation. Each person would get time to speak without interruption. We'd focus on resolving the venue complaint and establishing boundaries going forward, and she'd step in if things got heated or off track. Then Fiona's video clicked on, and her face filled a corner of the screen looking small and tired in a way that made me uncomfortable. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying recently, and her hair wasn't styled like it usually was. Tony invited her to share her perspective first, and Fiona took a shaky breath before speaking. She talked about feeling humiliated in front of 100 people, about the video going viral and strangers commenting on her worst moment, about losing friendships and facing judgment everywhere she went. Her voice sounded genuinely hurt, and I felt a twist of guilt in my stomach even though I'd been so sure she deserved consequences. But then she pivoted to blaming me for everything that happened, saying I planned her destruction from the start and manipulated the situation to make her look bad. She set me up, Fiona said, her voice getting stronger and more accusatory. She gave me that planning role knowing I'd make mistakes, and then she used those mistakes against me. Everything that happened was part of her scheme. I felt my jaw clench because she was right about the setup part, but wrong about everything else, refusing to take any responsibility for her own actions or the confession everyone heard. Halfway through the call, Fiona started crying for real. her shoulders shaking and her words coming out broken between sobs. "I've always been terrified of losing Pedro to someone else," she admitted through tears. "We grew up together and he's been my best friend my whole life, and I didn't know how to handle watching him fall in love with other people. Every time he got a girlfriend, I felt like I was replaced, like I was becoming invisible and unimportant." She talked about feeling abandoned and not knowing how to process her feelings except by trying to sabotage his relationships so things could go back to how they were before. "I know it was wrong," she said, wiping her face with shaking hands. "I know I hurt people and I messed up really badly, but I didn't know what else to do with how scared I felt." Her confession didn't excuse what she'd done or make the years of manipulation okay, but I understood her a little better in that moment. I could see the insecurity driving her actions, the fear of being left behind that made her do terrible things to people who didn't deserve it. She was a person in pain who dealt with it by hurting others, and that made her both sympathetic and still responsible for her choices. Tony cleared her throat and pulled us back to the practical side of things, suggesting we work through a formal agreement that would protect everyone going forward. She shared her screen showing a simple document with clear terms listed in bullet points, and I watched the cursor move as she typed our commitments in real time. The first point said we would both agree to complete no contact, meaning no calls or texts or social media messages or showing up at each other's homes or workplaces. The second point covered public discussion, stating that neither of us would post about the other online or talk about this situation with mutual friends or share any details that could identify the other person. The third point addressed the venue complaint specifically, with Fiona agreeing to withdraw it officially, and the venue agreeing to consider the matter closed once she did. Tony asked if we understood each term, and I nodded even though she couldn't see me, then remembered to say yes out loud. Pedro leaned closer to read the screen, and I heard him agree too. Fiona's voice came through quieter than before when she said she understood and would sign. Tony added a fourth point about both parties releasing each other from any future legal claims related to the engagement party incident, and I felt my stomach tighten because that made it all feel very official and final. She asked if we needed time to review with lawyers, but we all said no, that the terms were fair, and we just wanted this finished. Tony typed our names at the bottom and said she would email us copies to sign electronically, then asked if anyone had questions before we ended the call. The silence stretched for maybe 10 seconds before Fiona said she didn't have questions, and I said the same. Pedro thanked Tony for helping us reach an agreement, and I heard the professional warmth in his voice, the relief that we could close this chapter without more drama. Tony said she was glad we could resolve it maturely, and wished us all the best moving forward. Then the call disconnected, and I sat staring at the blank screen. Pedro stayed next to me on the couch, and neither of us spoke for a while, just processing what had happened and what it meant. I checked the time on my phone and realized the call had lasted almost an hour, even though it felt both longer and shorter somehow. My email pinged with the agreement from Tony, and I opened it to see the document we'd just discussed, now with signature lines highlighted in yellow. I clicked to sign and watched my typed name appear in cursive font that looked official and binding. Pedro signed his copy on his phone, and I heard the whoosh sound of him sending it back. We sat in silence for 10 full minutes afterward, not moving or talking, just existing in the space where Fiona used to be part of our lives, and now officially wasn't anymore. The rest of that day felt strange and heavy, like I was walking through water. I kept picking up my phone and opening apps without really knowing what I wanted to do, just feeling this need to mark the moment somehow. My fingers pulled up the post composer on 3 different platforms, and I started typing variations of the same message about how we'd resolved the venue complaint and reached a mature agreement. The words felt good to write, triumphant and justified, proof that I'd handled the aftermath responsibly, even if my initial plan was questionable. But every time I got close to posting, I heard Eliza's voice from our last therapy session talking about private repair versus public performance, about how real growth happens away from audiences and validation metrics. I stared at the draft posts with my thumb hovering over the share button, reading them over and over while my brain argued with itself about whether posting counted as violating our agreement. The no public discussion clause was pretty clear, but I kept finding ways to rationalize around it, thinking maybe I could phrase it vaguely enough that it wouldn't technically count. I rewrote the post 4 times trying to find the perfect balance of sharing without oversharing, celebrating without gloating, but each version felt slightly wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. My best friend's earlier words about becoming someone I'm proud of echoed in my head, and I realized posting would be sliding backward into old patterns. I closed the app without sharing anything and immediately felt the urge to open it again, this cycle repeating maybe 6 times over the next hour. The restraint felt physically difficult, like holding my breath or not scratching an itch, but I forced myself to put the phone face down on the coffee table and walk away. Pedro noticed me pacing and asked if I was okay, and I told him I was trying really hard not to post about the resolution. He squeezed my shoulder and said he was proud of me for choosing the harder path, and that simple acknowledgement made the restraint feel slightly more bearable. Midweek, Pedro met Aurelia for lunch at the sandwich place near his office, the one with the good soup and the outdoor tables where people go to escape fluorescent lights for an hour. He texted me a photo of his turkey club before they started talking, and I could see Aurelia's coffee cup at the edge of the frame. They spent the first 20 minutes catching up on work stuff and office gossip before Aurelia asked how he was really doing with everything. Pedro told me later that he admitted feeling scared about slowing down the engagement timeline, worried that pumping the brakes meant we were giving up, or that the magic would fade if we waited too long. But he also said he felt relieved to have space to work on our relationship properly, instead of just rushing toward a wedding date like we were running away from problems. Aurelia listened and nodded and reminded him that strong foundations take time to build, that the couples who last aren't the ones who sprint to the altar, but the ones who do the hard work first. She told him about her own engagement years ago when she and her husband almost called off the wedding 3 months before because they realized we were planning a party instead of a marriage. They postponed for a year and went to counseling and worked through their issues, and now they'd been married 15 years and never regretted taking that time. Pedro came home looking more settled than he had in weeks, his shoulders less tense and his smile reaching his eyes again. He wrapped me in a hug and said, Aurelia helped him see that we were making a brave choice instead of a scared one, that prioritizing our relationship over other people's expectations showed real maturity. In our third therapy session with Eliza the following week, we settled into the familiar chairs, and she started by asking how we felt about the mediation outcome. We both said it went better than expected, that having clear boundaries in writing made everything feel more manageable. Eliza nodded and made a note on her pad before looking up with a serious expression. She asked if we were ready to commit to 6 months of counseling before resuming any wedding planning, making it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but a necessary step if we wanted to build a healthy marriage. I glanced at Pedro, and he looked back at me, and we both said yes at the exact same time. No hesitation or doubt in either of our voices. Eliza smiled for real then. Not her professional therapist smile, but something warmer and more genuine. She said our immediate agreement showed growth, that we were prioritizing the marriage over the wedding, and that distinction mattered more than most couples realized. She pulled out a calendar and we blocked off weekly sessions for the next 6 months, picking a consistent time slot on Thursday evenings that we could both protect. Eliza explained we'd be working on communication patterns and conflict resolution and boundary setting, all the practical skills that make relationships work long-term. She said some sessions would be hard and uncomfortable, but if we stayed committed, the work would be worth it. We left that session holding hands and walking slower than usual, both of us processing the weight of what we'd just agreed to and feeling good about it despite the intimidation factor. That evening, I pulled out the journal my mom gave me for Christmas 2 years ago, the one with the leather cover that I'd only used for grocery lists and random to-do items. I flipped past the mundane pages to find a blank spread and started writing about why I actually wanted to marry Pedro beyond just winning against Fiona. My pen moved slowly at first, then faster as I got into the flow of honest thoughts. I wrote about his kindness, how he always asks the grocery store cashiers how their day is going, and actually listens to their answers. I wrote about his terrible dad jokes that make me groan and laugh at the same time, the way he commits fully to the bit even when nobody else thinks it's funny. I wrote about Sunday mornings when he brings me coffee in bed without me asking, always remembering that I like it with too much cream and 1 sugar. I listed the way he listens when I talk about work drama, asking follow-up questions that show he's really paying attention. I wrote about how he cried during our 3rd date when I told him about losing my grandmother, not embarrassed or trying to hide it, just feeling with me. I filled 3 full pages with specific moments and small gestures, and all the real reasons I said yes to his proposal, reasons that had nothing to do with Fiona or proving anything to anyone. Seeing it all written out in my own handwriting reminded me what I was fighting for, why doing the hard work in therapy mattered more than rushing to a wedding date. I closed the journal and put it on my nightstand where I could see it every morning, a physical reminder of the marriage I wanted to build instead of the wedding I wanted to perform. Late that night, I couldn't sleep and ended up scrolling social media in bed with the brightness turned down low. A post popped up from someone defending me against criticism in the comments, calling me smart for exposing Fiona's manipulation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard with a snarky response already forming in my head, something clever about how the truth always comes out eventually. I typed it out and read it twice, feeling that familiar rush of wanting to be right publicly and visibly. But then I stopped and thought about the person I was trying to become instead of the person I'd been, about all the work Pedro and I were doing to build something real and healthy. I thought about Eliza's words about private repair and how feeding drama online kept me stuck in old patterns. My thumb moved to the delete button and I erased the comment before posting, then closed the app entirely and put my phone on the dresser across the room. The victory felt small but significant, like I was choosing my future self over my present impulse. I rolled over and tried to sleep, feeling proud and frustrated in equal measure, knowing these tiny choices would add up to real change if I kept making them. The following weekend, we spent Saturday morning calling wedding vendors to pause or renegotiate our deposits. I had a spreadsheet open on my laptop with all the contact information and contract details, while Pedro handled most of the actual phone conversations. The florist was understanding when Pedro explained we needed to postpone indefinitely, saying she'd hold our deposit for up to a year, and we could rebook when we were ready. The photographer was less flexible, explaining her cancellation policy meant we'd lose half our deposit if we didn't reschedule within 6 months. We accepted the loss and thanked her for her time, both of us knowing this was part of the consequences of our choices. The venue coordinator asked if we wanted to pick a new date now or wait, and we said we'd call back when we finished counseling. The caterer charged us a processing fee but refunded most of our deposit, and the DJ said he'd waive his cancellation fee if we promised to rebook with him eventually. By the time we finished the last call, my hand hurt from writing notes, and Pedro's voice sounded tired from repeating our situation over and over. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said we'd do it right next time, that these vendors would get to see us at our best instead of our messiest. I squeezed back and felt grateful we were handling this together instead of letting it drive us apart. The week after that, we hosted a small dinner at our apartment with close friends and family to explain the postponement honestly. I spent all day cooking Pedro's mom's recipe for chicken enchiladas, while he cleaned and set up extra chairs around our dining table. People started arriving around 6, and I could feel the questions in the air, even though nobody asked them directly at first. We waited until everyone had food and drinks before Pedro cleared his throat and said we had something to share. I took a breath and admitted out loud that I handled the Fiona situation badly, that I manipulated circumstances instead of dealing with problems like an adult. I said we were working on building a healthier relationship foundation, and that meant postponing the wedding until we finished 6 months of counseling. Pedro added that we were committed to doing this right, and asked for everyone's support and patience while we worked on ourselves. The table got quiet for a moment, and I could see confusion on some faces and judgment on others, but mostly I saw people nodding and looking relieved that we were being honest. Pedro's mom reached over and patted my hand, saying she was proud of us for prioritizing the marriage. My best friend raised her glass and said, "Real love means doing hard things together." Not everyone seemed completely convinced, but being vulnerable felt better than pretending everything was fine, better than performing happiness we didn't actually feel yet. The next day, I took my niece out for ice cream at the shop with the Superman colors and the waffle cones that cost extra. She ordered mint chocolate chip in a regular cone, and I got vanilla with rainbow sprinkles in a cup. We sat at one of the wobbly outdoor tables, and I watched her lick ice cream off her fingers before I started talking. I apologized again for involving her in adult drama at the engagement party, for using her innocence as part of my plan without thinking about how it might affect her. She looked at me with those big 7-year-old eyes and gave me a sticky hug that smelled like mint and sunshine. She said she forgave me, that her mom explained I made a mistake, but I was trying to do better now. Her simple acceptance made something crack open in my chest, and I felt tears starting before I could stop them. We finished our ice cream and I drove her home, then sat in the parking lot after she went inside and cried for real. The tears felt like releasing something I'd been holding too tight, like my body finally processing all the shame and growth and change happening at once. Pedro spent Monday morning drafting a brief statement for his workplace about the engagement party situation. He typed and deleted and retyped probably 15 times before settling on 3 sentences that felt right. The statement said he appreciated people's concern, but considered the engagement party situation private, and wouldn't be discussing it further at work. He sent it to his supervisor first, and then forwarded it to a few key coworkers who'd asked questions, making it clear this was his final word on the topic. Then he committed to changing the subject if anyone brought it up, practicing polite deflection phrases with me the night before. Aurelia texted him later that week saying people respected the boundary, and the gossip died down quickly once he stopped feeding it with responses. She said setting that clear limit actually made people respect him more, seeing him handle personal drama with professionalism instead of letting it bleed into every work conversation. 2 days later, I opened my laptop to find an email from Tony with the subject line reading complaint resolution. My fingers shook slightly as I clicked it open and scanned the professional language explaining that Fiona had officially withdrawn her complaint against the venue. The email outlined a small administrative fee of $75 for processing the incident report and documenting the mediation call. I read through the attached invoice twice before pulling up our bank account and initiating the payment transfer. When the confirmation screen appeared, I sat back in my chair feeling this weird mix of relief and embarrassment. We were taking responsibility for our part in creating the situation, even though Fiona had started everything. The payment felt like closing a door I'd kicked open myself. I forwarded the email to Pedro with a short message saying it was done, and we could move forward now. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Thank you for handling it." Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself checking Fiona's social media profiles even though I knew I shouldn't. Her last post was from 3 days after the mediation call, and after that her accounts went quiet. No photos, no status updates, no passive-aggressive quotes about betrayal or fake friends. My best friend mentioned during coffee that she'd heard from someone who knew Fiona's roommate that Fiona was seeing a therapist twice a week. Another mutual acquaintance told Pedro at the grocery store that Fiona seemed to be taking real time away from social situations to work on herself. The no-contact boundary held solid on both sides without any attempts to reach out or accidental run-ins around town. I felt this bittersweet kind of peace settling over the situation, knowing she was getting help, but also knowing our paths wouldn't cross again. Sometimes I'd see a car that looked like hers, or hear a laugh that sounded similar, and my stomach would tense up before I realized it wasn't her. The fear response was fading slowly, but it still lived in my body. I scheduled my first individual session with Eliza on a Wednesday afternoon when Pedro was at work. The waiting room had the same calming blue walls and the same vanilla candle burning on the reception desk. Eliza greeted me with a warm smile and led me back to her office where I sank into the familiar couch. She started by asking what I wanted to focus on during our one-on-one time, and I told her about my need for control and how much I cared about what other people thought of me. We spent the next 45 minutes unpacking how my high school survival tactics had become my default setting, even when I wasn't actually in danger anymore. Eliza walked me through this exercise where I had to identify the difference between real threats and perceived threats. She asked me to describe a recent situation where I felt the urge to manipulate or control the outcome, and I told her about almost commenting on that social media post defending me. We examined what I was actually afraid would happen if I didn't control the narrative, and I realized I was terrified people would think I was weak or stupid. The work felt uncomfortable in a productive way, like stretching a muscle that had been tight for years. By the end of the session, Eliza gave me homework to notice when I was trying to control situations and pause before acting on that impulse. I left her office feeling raw but hopeful that I could recognize my patterns before they controlled me. Pedro found a stack of old photo albums in the hall closet the following weekend, while looking for our tax documents from 2 years ago. He called me over with this excited tone in his voice, and we spread the albums across our living room floor. We spent the next 3 hours looking through pictures of our relationship from the very beginning when we were both 22 and working at the same coffee shop. There were photos from our first date at the botanical gardens and screenshots of our early text conversations that made us both laugh. We found pictures from the camping trip where Pedro proposed and candid shots from random Tuesday nights watching movies on this couch. Looking at our actual history together instead of Fiona's version felt healing in a way I didn't expect. Pedro suggested we start planning a future slideshow for when we eventually do get married, one that actually centers both of us equally instead of anyone else. We started choosing moments that showed our real connection, like the time I surprised him at work with lunch when he was having a terrible day, or when he stayed up all night helping me finish a project for my job. Each photo we selected felt like reclaiming our story from the mess we'd made of it. By the time we closed the last album, my chest felt lighter, and Pedro was smiling in that genuine way that made me fall for him in the first place. Our next couples therapy session with Eliza focused on creating practical boundaries for our future together. She handed us a worksheet with categories like guest list decisions, friend access to our home, event protocols, and conflict resolution strategies. Pedro and I sat on opposite ends of the couch and worked through each section carefully. We wrote down that any guest list for our wedding or major events needed to be approved by both of us with no exceptions or surprise additions. We agreed that friends couldn't just show up at our apartment unannounced, and that we'd establish set times for social visits that worked for both our schedules. We created protocols for how we'd handle it if someone tried to create drama at future events, including having a designated person to escort them out if needed. The conflict resolution section took the longest, because we had to get specific about how we'd communicate when we disagreed, instead of me scheming or Pedro avoiding. We wrote down actual phrases we could use like, "I need time to think about this before responding," or "I'm feeling defensive right now and need a break." Having these clear guidelines written on paper made us both feel safer and more prepared for whatever came next. Eliza praised our work and made copies of our boundary document for each of us to keep. I called my mom on Sunday evening after putting off the conversation for 3 days. She answered on the second ring with her usual cheerful greeting and asked how wedding planning was going. I took a breath and told her I needed to talk to her about something important. My voice stayed steady as I explained that I loved her and valued her concern, but I needed her to stop trying to manage the situation or offer unsolicited advice. I said I was an adult dealing with adult consequences, and I needed to figure it out with Pedro and our therapist, not get constant reminders of my mistakes from her. The line went quiet for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then my mom said she was proud of me for setting the boundary, and that she'd been worried she was making things worse by hovering. She promised to step back and let me handle my own relationship while still being available if I actually asked for help. We talked for another 20 minutes about lighter topics like her garden and my dad's new obsession with woodworking. When we hung up, I felt this shift in our dynamic towards something healthier, like we were both growing into new versions of ourselves. The guilt I expected to feel never showed up, just relief that I'd finally said what needed saying. Pedro and I decided to test our new skills by planning a small backyard gathering with just a few close friends. We wanted something casual with no formal structure or speech requirements, just people hanging out and eating good food. Pedro took charge of the menu planning and spent an entire evening researching recipes for his famous pulled pork and homemade coleslaw. I handled the guest list and kept it to 8 people, including us, making sure everyone we invited was genuinely supportive and drama-free. We both committed to keeping things simple without any elaborate decorations or complicated timeline. The planning process itself felt different this time, more collaborative and way less stressful than the engagement party had been. Pedro would check in with me before making decisions, and I would ask his opinion instead of just doing what I wanted. We picked a date 3 weeks out to give ourselves time to prepare without overthinking every detail. I ordered some basic string lights for the backyard, and Pedro borrowed his brother's portable speaker for music. Neither of us felt the need to prove anything or create some perfect Instagram moment. We just wanted to spend time with people we cared about. The backyard gathering happened on a sunny Saturday in late April with temperatures in the mid-70s. Our friends started arriving around 2 in the afternoon, bringing side dishes and bottles of wine. Pedro manned the grill while I set up the drink station and made sure everyone had what they needed. The afternoon went smoothly, despite a few awkward pauses when people didn't quite know what to say about the engagement party situation. One friend mentioned seeing the video online and the conversation stalled until I just said, yeah, that was a mess we're working through. Everyone seemed relieved that I acknowledged it without making it a whole thing. We handled the tension with grace instead of performance, just being honest when things felt weird instead of pretending everything was perfect. By late afternoon, people were laughing and sharing stories while Pedro's music playlist created a comfortable background atmosphere. I found myself actually relaxing instead of monitoring everyone's reactions or trying to control the vibe. When the last guests left around 7, I felt satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. Pedro and I cleaned up together in comfortable silence, and I realized this was what I actually wanted: real connection without all the performance. That night, we debriefed on the couch about what worked and what still felt triggering. Pedro praised how I stayed present during the awkward moments instead of performing or deflecting. He said he noticed me taking deep breaths when things got tense, and choosing honesty over trying to manage people's perceptions. I told him I was proud of how he set boundaries with our friend Noah, who kept pushing him to drink more when Pedro wanted to stay sober and clear-headed. He'd said no thanks. I'm good 3 times with increasing firmness until Noah finally dropped it. We talked about how we both felt nervous before people arrived, but the actual event was less stressful than we'd built it up to be in our heads. Pedro admitted he was still working on not people-pleasing, and I admitted I was still working on not needing everyone to like me. The conversation felt productive and connecting instead of like we were just listing problems. We were both learning, and it showed in small ways that added up to real progress. The next day, we sat together at the Kit Smith table with my laptop open to our social media accounts. We'd drafted and revised a joint announcement about 15 times over the past week, trying to get the tone right. The final version said we were postponing the wedding to focus on personal growth and strengthening our relationship. We explained that we loved each other deeply, but recognized we had work to do before making a lifelong commitment. The message was honest without being dramatic or oversharing details that weren't anyone else's business. Pedro read it out loud one more time, and we both agreed it felt right. I hit post on my account, and he shared it to his. Then we closed our laptops and went for a walk to avoid obsessively checking responses. When we got back an hour later, the comments were mostly supportive, with friends saying they respected our honesty and maturity. A few people sent private messages offering encouragement or sharing their own relationship struggles. My mom commented with a heart emoji and the words, "Proud of you both." I felt steady and confident in a way I hadn't since before the engagement party, like we were finally building something real instead of just reacting to crisis after crisis. That evening, we settled onto the couch together with my legs tucked under me and Pedro's arm around my shoulders. The living room felt quiet and safe after all the noise of the past weeks. He pulled me closer, and I could feel his breath warm against my ear when he whispered that he could feel trust rebuilding between us slowly. His voice was soft, but steady when he said he wasn't scared anymore that I would scheme instead of talking to him. I turned to look at him and told him I was learning to believe he would actually keep boundaries strong this time. The moment felt tender in a way that made my chest ache, like we'd fought hard to earn this kind of closeness. We stayed there for another hour just breathing together, and I realized this was what healing actually felt like. Not dramatic or perfect, but real and hard-won. Later that night, after Pedro fell asleep, I grabbed my journal from the nightstand and carried it to the Kit Smith table. I clicked on the small lamp and started writing about how getting exactly what I wanted with Fiona had cost me more than I thought it would. The pen moved fast across the page as I admitted that yes, I got her out of our lives completely. But I almost lost Pedro in the process, and almost became someone I didn't want to be. The victory felt hollow when I really looked at it, empty in the center where satisfaction should have been. But the growth afterward, the therapy sessions and hard conversations and learning to be honest, that part felt real and valuable in ways the revenge never did. I filled 3 pages before my hand cramped, and I finally closed the journal, feeling lighter. The next morning, we sat together at the Kit Smith table with our therapy schedule pulled up on my laptop. 6 months of weekly sessions stretched out in front of us in neat little calendar boxes. Pedro reached over and squeezed my hand when we clicked the confirmation button, officially committing to the work ahead. No contact with Fiona was holding strong with her number blocked on both our phones. Our families were finally aligned on boundaries after weeks of difficult conversations. We were learning to solve problems without schemes or avoidance, choosing honesty even when it felt uncomfortable. The future still felt uncertain in some ways because we didn't have all the answers yet, but it also felt hopeful in a way it hadn't before, like we were building something solid instead of just reacting to whatever crisis came next. I looked at Pedro across the table and felt genuinely excited to marry this man when we were both ready, when we'd done the work and earned the kind of partnership we both deserved.